The second leg of the South African Human Rights Commission's inquiry into claims of racial discrimination in the regional advertising business starts today. To talk to us about the role of the media in ensuring content they carry is not discriminatory or offensive, we're joined by Media Monitoring Africa's Director, William Bird. A very good morning to you, William. Thanks for making the time.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me on the program.
Just this morning, we wake up to news that Nigeria becomes the first country to ban foreign models in TV ads. Quite an interesting one. But William, what's the role of the media in ensuring that the content they carry is not deemed discriminatory or even offensive?
So I think that's, when you're looking at this and you're talking about advertising, it's quite different to news, and the media's relationship with advertising, depending on what kind of media you have, can be quite difficult. So there's a tension between purely commercial media and advertisers, where often advertisers, because of the fact that they are, contributing to the sustainability of the media organization, have a lot of power over them. And often that's led to, sometimes advertising agencies pushing the boundaries a little bit, and media organizations accepting those adverts without necessarily thinking too carefully about them. Sometimes you can see that can lead them into trouble politically before you even get into racism and sexism in advertising. If you think recently about the apology letter from Bain, whether the news organisation that carried that full-page spread should have taken that advert is something that they need to consider. They should have said, well, is this true or not? So that's why you do have an advertising regulatory board that is there, that's similar to the Broadcast Complaints Commission, that looks at content. The ARB looks and reviews content in relation to advertising, and if people have a complaint or concern about that they think is offensive or discriminatory, then they can report it to that, and they'll go through a process, and that works really well, actually. So to that extent, it's a good thing. We're also unlikely to find overtly offensive adverts in the sense of being obviously racist or obviously sexist. These days, these things tend to occur more often as a pattern. More often they'll fulfill particular stereotypes about the role of women, for example, that they're the ones that are always doing the domestic work, or that that black people are criminals. Those kinds of stereotypes still do occur.
So if found that media carries such offences, what's their responsibility thereafter?
So I mean, the thing is that ultimately, in as much as if there is content that you want to complain about, that there's a process for that. The media, because it's their medium, SABC is responsible, as an example, for the adverts that you carry. So if someone has a problem with an advert on SABC, it's in as much as you may complain about that to the Advertising Regulatory Board, and the advertiser may be found guilty of violating the code. Equally, there's a legitimate process and concern to be saying to the SABC, well, why did you broadcast that to begin with? You have final editorial responsibility over what goes out on your channels. Of course, these days with digital, it gets a lot harder to determine, because on social media and on digital media, you get programmatic advertising, so advertising that just gets bought in the free spaces that occur on people's digital platforms, for example. And those, it's a lot more difficult to determine which adverts they are, because they tend to be served or shown to the people that view them, depending on who that person is. So if I'm looking for cars and to buy a new car, when I go onto SABC site, it'll tend to show me car adverts as an example, right? So then it starts to become a lot more tricky. So one of the key areas that people are looking at now is how do you manage to make sure that the adverts that go in there are something that aren't discriminatory or offensive. So then you've got a bigger problem in that you're now dealing with a global entity like a Google, which is responsible for the overwhelming majority of online ads. And so you've got to say, well, how do we match what we consider offensive and discriminatory against what a global platform like Google does, and how do we start to get these systems to work together that encourage a rights-based approach, for example.
So on social media, advertisements that take accountability, who takes accountability or responsibility if an offensive advert makes its way there?
So again, it can be reported to the Advertising Regulatory Board, but obviously then you're dealing with a platform like Google, and then it would fall to Google to potentially have that advert removed, or for them to no longer want to carry that. But you'd ultimately hold the advertiser who put that advert there responsible for producing that ad. So if it's provided, of course, it's produced here. If you're getting an advert that is for a product that isn't made here, and in fact the advertising company does not have any local representation, well, then you've got a much bigger problem in terms of accountability. And so what you then have to start saying is you need two things to occur. A, you need advertisers to ensure that they're advertising with credible media houses, because they're the ones that need the money, so they should be going and supporting the SABC as an example. But equally, you need the news organizations, news and media organizations, to be saying to the advertisers and those platforms through the Google ads, etc., that they only want actually credible products and credible things. Because equally, you don't want adverts for pornography, for example, on SABC's website, because that would be completely counter to the SABC's mandate. And if it was there, then obviously people would have legitimate concerns about that.
Just in terms of how adverts enforce stereotypes, how does this come about? How do adverts enforce stereotypes?
So often, because adverts, historically, because they've got to get a message through in 30 seconds or less, they tend to rely on ideas, symbols, images, portrayals, versions of how they perceive society in order to help build up that story. So when you're wanting to advertise a toilet cleaning product, for example, you want to go into the home and show that it's the person there that's doing the cleaning. You're likely to find that that's, in most instances, going to be some kind of a woman represented doing those kinds of domestic work. Now, to a degree, of course, that matches with the reality that women do tend to do most of that work. But of course, women do a whole lot more things than just domestic work. So often those stereotypes will have a grain of truth to them, but it's about the fact that that's how women have tended to be portrayed in advertising, that you see those particular things always occurring, that it's always a woman, and they usually have to have a particular look. For the woman that advertised in clothes, or the woman that advertised makeup or other products, their particular stereotypes about them and what their body looks like and what they need to look like. And one of the obvious ways of seeing this, of course, is if you look along the lines of race, where previously only high-end products would have been targeted at white women, for example, and not at black women, because they thought that they didn't fit into that particular market. And so some of those things have started to shift now, but a lot of those kinds of stereotypes about black people being poor and white women always being wealthy, etc., and their particular looks, what their hair looks like, all those kinds of things feed directly into that, and because of the power of them, because they're repeated so frequently, often there's a sense that helps create what our society should look like, whether you have women with weaves, without weaves, all those kinds of things play into the advertising stereotypes. And then of course you've got those that tend to challenge it. Some of the brands like Nando's is well known for frequently challenging just how far you can push boundaries when you do advertising. They tend to speak to a very hot button political issue, and they will respond directly to that. So you do get advertising that does challenge, but obviously frequently a lot of it just fits into the norm and those standards of how you go and want to advertise soap products or insurance, all of those kinds of things.
Well, thank you so much for just giving us, enlightening us on this particular conversation. William Bird there from Media Monitoring Africa.